The introduction of tougher tiered restrictions. And Bloomberg learns that President-elect Joe Biden has landed on longtime advisor Antony Blinken as his Secretary of State. He may make the announcement as soon as early this week. Good morning, everybody. European equity market futures then had been pointing to the upside even before we got the news out of AstraZeneca. Then we saw that AstraZeneca news drop at 0700 London time. And as a result of that, futures move even more to the upside. The earlier optimism driven by the timetable for actually distributing the vaccine in the United States and the Astra news just adding to that positivity. So we did see an expectation then instantly in markets that we would see some of the more responsive stocks to the pandemic story very much on the move this morning. So we're very focused to see if that indeed comes to pass. I'm just looking at the early trade on the stocks to watch. I can see that IAG, International Consolidated Airlines Group, up by more than 4% this hour. So that is certainly an early mover to the upside. I also see companies such as Unibail Rodamco. They're, of course, operator of shopping malls and the like. There perhaps is some read across Klépierre in the same space. Also some read across from the AstraZeneca story. I also see some of the other stocks to watch on the move, the likes of Crédit Agricole. Is that about higher yields, though? Is that a pan-banking story as we start to see slightly higher yields, perhaps, in the offing as we get better news around the vaccine? Let's get to that vaccine story then. AstraZeneca's COVID vaccine prevents, on average, 70% of COVID cases, according to initial results of a large trial. That falls short of the bar set by Pfizer and Moderna, whose vaccines were found to be about 95% effective. Let's talk to Sam Fazeli again, Bloomberg Intelligence EMEA Research Director. And Sam, you've now had a bit more time to get your head into this piece of news from AstraZeneca. If we compare 70% from Astra with 95% from the other trials, the earlier trial results, is that comparing apples with apples, or do we have to compare only part of the Astra trial with the news out of the other drug makers?
Good morning, Anna. So, what we have to do is just to run with the 70%. That difference that they talk about, the 90% and 60%, half dose, full dose, that's kind of irrelevant because from a statistical perspective, that's probably not something that they had pre-specified in their analysis, which means there's not much value to it. So 70% is the number. We're going to have to run with that. And it's obviously lower than the other vaccines. But still 70% efficacy is 70% efficacy. It's the sort of numbers we were looking for, expecting these vaccines to come out at. So then now the question, of course, Anna, is what do we do with this vaccine?
Right, yes, and tell me about that, because this is a more traditional vaccine, isn't it? This is not messenger RNA, this is a more traditional one. It therefore has big implications for the ability to distribute it and for the price, crucially, for emerging market economies. So what do we do with this vaccine and the others?
Yeah, so it's still not as traditional as the vaccines that you and I are used to. It is still an engineered vaccine using another virus, so they're still quite, we don't have a vaccine like this on the market at the minute. So what this means is that whoever uses this vaccine will have to inoculate more people in their population to achieve so-called herd immunity. The lower the efficacy of a vaccine, the more people you need to inoculate to get there. But of course, given that they're talking about 3 billion doses next year, and given that it's much cheaper, and given that it only requires refrigeration, that should be relatively easier to achieve than the other two vaccines.
Yes, I mean, we were already pushing in this direction from a market perspective, weren't we, Sam? After we saw the initial results from Pfizer, BioNTech and Moderna, we saw this very risk-on move in markets. And today we sit here with Rolls-Royce, biggest gainer on the stock 600. HelloFresh distributes food at your doorstep, down by 4.4%. So the market is running once again with this narrative that this is risk-on, that this is going to help our economies recover. And I suppose that's bottom line is the case, isn't it, Sam?
It is indeed, because what it also tells you, Anna, is that it's quite likely that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine will work too. Potentially better, because there are some differences in the design, and they were a lot more deliberate in the way they've done their calculations and the trial structure. So that's due sometime in first quarter. If that hits too, that's a similar kind of refrigeration, etc. So this is the right message for the market to be taking.
Okay, thanks very much. Sam Fazeli, Bloomberg Intelligence EMEA Research Director. Worth noting that AstraZeneca moves to the downside, but just by 0.5%. I wonder how much of that is due to the findings of this report. If you didn't think they were as good as you'd hoped for, or maybe it's because they are good that the whole sector goes a little bit weaker and we rotate out of defensives. Let's get to April LaRousse, Insight Investment Management Fixed Income Specialist, who can join us with her insights this morning. April, really good to speak to you. We sit here with the 10-year yield at 82 basis points. When we saw the Pfizer news hitting the market, we saw a pickup in those yields. Some of that's been unwound a little bit. Where would you expect yields to go then, as we seem to be building more and more positive news around vaccines? Maybe not as positive as the Pfizer story, but the AstraZeneca vaccine certainly showing effectiveness. How high can that kind of news flow push the 10-year yield?
Yeah, well, actually, as you just mentioned, you can see that it's been reversing a little bit since the initial Pfizer news. And I think that's, typically what you see in markets. You get a bit of news, the market gets quite excited. In this case, Treasury yield sold off a touch. And then the next time you get sort of similar news, the reaction is sort of less and less. So we're actually thinking that probably in the short term, you've seen kind of all the sell-off you're going to see from the Treasury market, because they've kind of adjusted to the idea that the vaccine news is on schedule. I think the key thing for us really is, though, just because they've developed really effective vaccines doesn't mean the entire population has been vaccinated. The rollout schedule is likely to not be sort of, available to the greater population really till, if we're lucky, the tail end of next year. So really the Treasury market needs to focus on the fact that we're still in a situation where we have incredibly low interest rates, where the Fed is going to continually buy treasuries, and the Treasury purchases are unlimited. And of course, they are going to keep a lid on yields.
I wonder, though, April, if we do start to get more certainty about a time scale for vaccination, even if vaccination has not taken place yet, I wonder if that increased certainty then pushes up the confidence of consumers to consume, of businesses to invest, and of animal spirits to I was going to say return to markets. It's almost as if they never left, or certainly they've been back with a vengeance recently, haven't they? But I mean, does it, even if we haven't vaccinated yet, the news that vaccination is coming certainly does something to confidence levels?
Yeah, and we certainly would expect to see things like, for example, the more cyclical parts of the corporate bond markets continue to perform well, and we've already seen that. And I know you were just talking about, parts of the equity market which had been very badly damaged by, sort of very low animal spirits and the economy kind of coming back. But really, when it comes to thinking about government bonds, we really think that, financial repression is here to stay for now. And it is really not the Fed's interests, or indeed the incoming administration's interests, to see Treasury yields materially higher. So maybe you see something like a further 10 to 20 basis point sell-off, but we think that would be greeted by quite a lot of interested buying. And actually, the other thing we wouldn't be surprised to see is the Fed actually thinking about what it's buying in terms of where on the yield curve the QE purchases are happening. And perhaps they start looking at buying slightly longer dated bonds, because they've been buying quite a lot at the front end. If they start shifting more to intermediate or longer dated bonds, that could actually have quite a nice impact of dampening down those yields and keeping them nice and low, which is ultimately what they need until the economy's properly on a strong footing.
Yeah, I mean, April, it seems incredible to think back to a time before COVID-19. We were talking about lower for longer interest rates even then, weren't we? And now we're talking for even longer, I guess. So what does lower for longer really mean now in the post-COVID world? Even as economies start to recover, how long do we have these low interest rates for? Central banks, as you say, buying up a lot of this debt that governments are issuing. Will be mindful of those interest rates.
Yes, our forecast horizon really doesn't stretch out much beyond 2 years, but on that horizon, what we are seeing is the same level of interest rates. So ultimately, there's no real probability that they start increasing interest rates off current levels for a couple of years. There really wouldn't be any reason why, unless there's a genuine concern about inflation. And as we sit here now, the amount of spare capacity in the economy, I mean, you still have 10 million people unemployed in the United States. There is absolutely no rush to be tightening policy. And of course, what they want to do is not have the mistake, which is, tightening policy too soon. And one of the reasons that they were changing the inflation framework in the US is they acknowledge the fact that historically central banks have hiked too early. So they don't want to make that mistake. They want to see actual growth, actual inflation in the US coming back into the system before they start hiking.
Okay, thanks very much, April. April LaRousse, Insight Investment Management fixed income specialist. She stays with us. We'll get further thoughts from her in just a moment. I just want to mention a few of the key movers we've been keeping our eye on. AstraZeneca, we've been showing you these share prices during that early conversation. AstraZeneca down by 0.8%. It is the biggest points contributor to the downside to the stock 600. So is this around the results? Is this a verdict on the results? Or is this just selling off the healthcare space? We also see Novo Nordisk moving lower, GlaxoSmithKline moving lower, Reckitt Benckiser in healthcare and cleaning products, of course, also lower. So there could be that story in there as well. IAG moves to the upside, up by 3.8%. HelloFresh doing a deal and also responding to the AstraZeneca news, down by 3.6%. Coming up, we'll be back with April for our next conversation, the lasting legacy of the pandemic. Are newly debt-laden businesses the biggest long-term risk for Europe? We'll discuss that next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the European Market Open. 13 minutes into a European equity session that looks broadly positive, up around 0.5% on the time horizon for vaccinations in the US. News flow there, and very importantly, data out of AstraZeneca about efficacy. Let's talk about the debt picture for European companies, though. Long after the pandemic has passed, its most damaging economic legacy may not be the swathes of government debt, but instead the hundreds of billions of euros of liabilities on companies' balance sheets. Businesses have been driven to bank loans and bond issuance, kept affordable by ultra-low rates and government guarantees to survive a year of stop-start shutdowns. But when the crisis support ends, the finances of businesses are likely to be stretched to breaking point, with smaller firms across the continent already sounding the alarm. This, according to some of our colleagues tracking very closely the European corporate debt picture. April LaRousse, Insight Investment Management fixed income specialist, is still with us. April, how concerned are you for European companies about the amount of debt being taken on at this point, and how sustainable that will prove to be?
Yeah, well, we are concerned. We do look at the leverage numbers, particularly in the investment grade space. We've been noticing that they've been steadily creeping higher. The thing that makes us feel slightly more relaxed is that interest affordability is very high. And so companies are, they have been able to issue debt at incredibly low coupons. This means that debt is hugely easy for them to afford, even with current levels of cash flow. So, we're looking at that and we're thinking, okay, they're going to need to address that. But they're not going to try and address it in the middle of a pandemic. I think the other thing that we are mindful of is that most of the rhetoric coming out of the European Central Bank, but also of the Bank of England is, they want to be there to be supportive of companies. They ultimately want them to get through this period, as long as the business model is something that is, sustainable and a going concern. So we don't think what you're going to see is a big raft of defaults in the investment grade space, but it is certainly going to lead to some rating changes. And the rating agencies were very active earlier on in the quarter, and we think that you'll see a bit more activity as we go through the next couple of quarters.
Okay, April, just pause for a second. We're just going to bring French PMI data to viewers. November manufacturing PMI, 49.1. That is just below the forecast of 49.9. The services PMI falling to 38. The forecast was for 39.6. So all of these numbers below 50, signifying contraction. No surprise, the services sector is in a worse state than manufacturing, because it's just more difficult for services in November to operate as usual. When you look at what we've just been talking about, the corporate debt picture, and you look at the reality that these businesses are facing, certainly these are the French numbers. We're going to get further PMI numbers as we go through the day. How concerned are you about the jobs picture in Europe as a result of this? Are you seeing that the trajectory for jobs is going to get a lot worse in Europe before it then maybe gets better, or how do you assess that?
Yes, we do think that. Well, helpfully, the job picture has stayed pretty good, thanks to all the very rapid and frankly, generous plans to help keep companies going and help keep their employees on the balance sheet, or on the payroll for now. But we don't think that necessarily that's something that's going to be able to be sustained. So what we think is that even with some of these generous support packages for businesses, that they might be looking at their businesses and saying, you know what, we probably aren't going to see the same level of activity even in a COVID-free world. So, we are starting to see, repeated announcements of redundancies. And that is something that we think we'll continue to see. So even with that support, businesses are obviously trying to evaluate what's the right amount of staffing for the next few years, as opposed to in the middle of a pandemic.
Just want to break in, April, with a few lines coming through from other media. This is UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock saying that the bulk of the rollout of the Astra vaccine will be in the new year. I'm not sure how he defines the new year, but that's the time horizon he's looking at. He says the number of virus cases has clearly started to fall. So this is the UK Health Secretary just giving us some of the UK context here. Of course, the UK context and the gilt context that you look at, April, is complicated by Brexit matters. I wonder how you unpick all of these various influences and what's going to make gilts move then as we head from 2020 into 21. Is it going to be Brexit news flow? Is it virus news flow? What's in focus for you?
It's kind of a little bit of everything. I mean, we also have the spending review coming this week, which is something that the gilt market will be of interest. We'll be focusing on, just given how much gilt issuance is likely to come. So, the amount of gilts that are likely to be issued is definitely up for debate. We need to see as well what they're going to do on something like green gilts, because they did effectively announce their sort of Green New Deal. How are they actually going to fund that? The Brexit negotiations, we keep watching that with interest and keep wondering, when are they actually going to set a deadline that sticks? These sort of constant moving of the deadline is somewhat of a frustration. So gilts are effectively trading pretty highly correlated with other markets and really just not doing a whole lot. They did see a sell-off similar to what you saw in U.S. Treasuries, but really, have sort of more or less stayed within their normal range. So Brexit is something we're focusing on. Obviously, vaccine timing and news is something we're focusing on, the spending review. And of course, there is some comment going around the market that perhaps they keep the lockdown in place slightly longer than initially suggested. So, that's something else that obviously would have an impact on UK growth and therefore would be of interest to the gilt market.
Yeah, that would be of interest, given the pledges over the weekend that this will come to an end. Of course, we don't know what the tiered system looks like, though. It might look, some tiers might look a lot like what we're in at the moment. April, thank you very much for joining us today. April LaRousse, Insight Investment Management Fixed Income Specialist. April will be continuing her conversation with us at Bloomberg, but on Bloomberg Radio at 9 a.m. UK time. Let's get a Bloomberg Business Flash then. Some of the top corporate stories we're covering today here at Bloomberg. The COVID-19 vaccine from Oxford University and AstraZeneca prevents on average 70% of COVID cases, below the high bar, of course, set by Pfizer and Moderna. One of the dosing regimes, though, offers 90% protection. The other is less effective. The big advantage of this vaccine is that it can be stored at refrigerator temperatures. UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock says the bulk of vaccinations are likely to be rolled out in the new year. He was talking, of course, about the UK story there. Blackstone is doubling down on Asia. Sources tell Bloomberg it's seeking to raise at least $5 billion for its second private equity fund focused on the region. That's more than double the size of its first. Deal flows are starting to pick up and investors are keen on the region as it's recovering faster from coronavirus. Women in finance are much less likely to be promoted unless they ask for it. That's according to a new study in Australia. It says over 3/4 of men have been offered a promotion without asking. That compares with just 57% for women. The report also says male fund managers on average earn more than twice as much as female. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Coming up on the program, President-elect Joe Biden begins to assemble his cabinet, though Donald Trump has yet to concede. We'll get details on this developing news story. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the European Market Open. 23 minutes into your trading session. European equity markets to the upside, up by 0.9% now, so increasingly moving to the upside. US equity market futures also point higher this morning. Now, President-elect Joe Biden is planning to name longtime aide Antony Blinken as Secretary of State, the nation's top diplomat. That is according to several Bloomberg sources. Former Hillary Clinton aide Jake Sullivan is expected to be National Security Advisor. An announcement could come as soon as Tuesday of this week. Joining us now is Derek Wallbank, our senior editor. Derek, what do we know then about Antony Blinken? He does seem to be pretty well known.
Well, yeah, Tony Blinken is a bit of a veteran diplomatic hand in Washington. He's been with Joe Biden for many, many, many years, and his views are what we might call simpatico with Biden's, which is to say that after 4 years of hearing U.S. officials say something and then wondering what the top, most senior U.S. official, the president, was going to say about it, instead here you're very likely to have situations where when Tony Blinken says something, it's exactly where Joe Biden wants to be. And that's going to be a little bit of a jarring reality for folks who may have been practiced at trying to play one person off of another and one situation off of another, that instead the U.S. is going to be possibly an extremely more tightly run ship, especially more tightly run even than the Obama administration.
Derek, thank you very much. Thanks for the update. So Derek Wallbank, our senior editor, with the latest on US political maneuvering. Let's get to, talking of maneuvering, let's get to the markets and see what is maneuvering this morning. We've got European equity markets finding some higher ground. So the stock 600 up by 0.7%. And let's have a look at some of the individual names. Cineworld, really big moves coming through in Cineworld, up by around 18% right now. And this is not just to do with the AstraZeneca vaccine and any read across there, although that is boosting stocks in that leisure space. Cineworld securing a new debt facility of $450 million. That is also topical. AstraZeneca was moving lower and continues to do so, in fact, increasingly so, down by 1.4%. Other big pharma companies are also negative, as this would be, as you would expect, on a risk-on day, reacting to better news out of Astra, or at least confirmation of vaccine effectiveness. You are seeing a rotation away from healthcare stocks, but are we seeing some reluctance to own Astra as a result of the vaccine being 70% effective rather than 95%? We'll see. HelloFresh is also on the move. That particular stock down by over 3% over in Germany. They've bought Factor 75. They're also cut to underweight at JP Morgan, and of course responding to the latest AstraZeneca news flow. Up next, we will get to the Brexit conversation, the last mile. Both the UK and the EU sound optimistic about striking a Brexit deal. The word from Brussels next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the European Market Open. 30 minutes into a positive trading session for European equity markets. French PMIs have already been released this morning. German numbers just dropping now. Let's get straight to Bloomberg's Danny Berger to look at the latest data. Danny, what have we got?
Anna, it looks like we actually have some of the figures coming in better than expected for Germany. Manufacturing PMIs coming in at 57.9. The forecast was 56. Composite PMI fell to 52. The forecast there was 50.5. So that means for a total, that's the composite rather. The services then fell to 46.2. Forecast was 46.3. So a tiny bit weaker in services, but composite and manufacturing overall are stronger. Now, earlier, not too long ago, we got France. That was a more severe drop-off, but we did expect that given that the French lockdowns were more widespread than that of Germany. And France, for its part, missed on all measures. I should say, look out later today. We're going to get something that IHS Markit usually doesn't do, and that's breaking out the big two. So we get Germany and France by itself, but then we'll also get the rest of the European area nations together. And this is useful to kind of gauge the unevenness of the European recovery, to see what the core has done. We just got those numbers versus some of the other nations. So what we know so far is German activity looking stronger than that contraction we saw in France, Anna.
And what about some of the high-frequency data, Danny? We were discussing a little bit earlier on how it shows this sort of double dip pattern, but of course not as severe a dip this time around as we saw back in the spring. What kind of evidence of the very recent performance of these European economies do we see from that high-frequency information?
We certainly see that in some of these activity gauges. So this includes things like public transportation, energy usage. All those things show exactly what you're talking about, Anna, that we had another dip going into this most recent spate of lockdowns, but certainly not as severe. The PMI data we're seeing confirms that as well. But I should say that what we first see is a pretty large drop-off in the first couple weeks of November. That's especially true for France. But recently, it does look like we're starting to see a leveling out of that activity data. So while the PMIs, of course, is a longer period look back, this high frequency data shows places like France, where we saw this big miss on services, start to show a bit of recovery, even surpassing the activity levels of the UK, given this high frequency data. So this does indicate a bit of hope. And look, nothing nearly as severe as what we saw back in the spring.
Thanks very much, Danny. Danny Berger with the latest there on the European growth story. Brexit, of course, we are.
Good morning, everybody. I am placing an order to sell short euro. Let me just see where it will end up, this candle. I just want to remind that this is 1 minute candle chart. So let's see when it will end up. And the order placed at 118.73. Okay, order placed to sell short at 118.73.
Then would you say a deal is still the best case scenario here?
Well, I think we absolutely need a deal. I think not having a deal would be very bad news for the UK and for the European Union. And I think there's cautious optimism. I think we've had so many false starts about this in the past, and there still are some hurdles. I think the view from Brussels largely is that at the end of the day, this will depend on the calculus in Downing Street and the domestic politics of deal or no deal. But I think the work has been done. The texts are 95% ready, we're told, legally drafted. We just need to find the compromise on the three outstanding points, and of course the issue of the internal market bill. And then this deal could indeed be done, and I hope it will.
And David, I know that in the times that we've talked off camera, you've said that the key really is the Prime Minister showing that he is serious about a deal and that he wants a deal. So I do wonder, how can he show that? How can he show Brussels that I want a deal and I'm serious about it? What can he do?
Well, I think in the end it will come down to probably a phone call between the Prime Minister and the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, or Charles Michel, or both, in which they agree the final compromise. I mean, we know the gaps are there, but they're relatively small, they're bridgeable, and I think it just for the moment each side is saying, I'm not going to go to my final.
The sticking points, we know that fish is an area where the Brits always say we need a win or something that we can present as a win. Can he get a win on that front without upsetting someone like, for example, Emmanuel Macron?
Well, you can be sure, Maria, that when the deal is finally announced, both sides will declare it as a great victory. So that's the way of these things. I think on fish, it is a difficult issue. It is an emotional issue. It's not economically terribly important, but it is important for the fishing communities, both in the UK and within the EU. I think the initial EU position that nothing would change after Brexit is not sustainable. Equally, we know that for the UK, they must regain sovereignty, or they will regain sovereignty over their waters. But equally, most of the fish they catch, they don't eat, and they actually sell into the European market. So they need a deal in order to keep those markets open. So I have no doubt that this will not be the point which brings the talks to a halt. This is a perfectly doable compromise, I'm sure.
Okay, that's a good line. And I also want to ask you, in Brussels, I often hear that there's been recent changes in number 10, especially when you look at Dominic Cummings leaving number 10, that perhaps could signal that the Prime Minister is going to be softer now on Brexit. I do wonder whether that is a mistake, whether that is reading too much into a situation. Fundamentally, the positions when it comes to Europe hasn't really shifted that much.
Well, this is all speculative about what happens inside number 10, and I don't think any of us really can claim to have those kind of insights. What is clear is that at the end of the day, it will be for Prime Minister Johnson to decide whether, for his domestic politics, it is better to announce a victory, which will lessen the impact of the big changes that are going to come on the 1st of January, simultaneous with the difficult economic situation as a result of COVID, or whether the reaction from his backbenchers will be against any compromise, will be so virulent that he's better going for a no deal. I think this is the political calculation that he is going to make, and until he has made that calculation, I think it's not possible to know which direction this is going to go in. I think most people would hope, and I think people around him who know are advising that a deal would be in the UK's best interest, as it would indeed be in the best interest of the EU 27.
Right, and now that you mentioned that political calculus, we also know that the international context has changed. There's been an election in the United States. Joe Biden has often played up the fact that his ancestors were Irish, that he's also said the Good Friday Agreement has to be respected, that he does believe in respecting international deals. I wonder if that is something that now the Prime Minister has to also factor into his domestic calculus. And I do also wonder just how relevant is this? Are we playing up the fact that Joe Biden may be less of a Brexiteer as President Trump was, who was openly in favor of Brexit?
I'm sure the election of President Biden has slightly tilted the odds in favor of a deal, but I don't believe it will be decisive. I mean, I repeat, Prime Minister Johnson, in my view, will make this calculation largely based on his assessment of the domestic political situation in the UK. But it is true that President Biden, or future President Biden's deep attachment to the Northern Ireland peace process will create difficulties if there is no deal, because then we will be left with this vexed issue of the internal market bill, which is in breach of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the withdrawal agreement. If there is a deal, it presumably would be possible for those offending articles discreetly to be dropped on the basis that they were no longer necessary. So I think that is, yes, another factor that plays into a greater likelihood of a deal, but I don't think it's decisive.
Well, David O'Sullivan, former European Union ambassador to the United States, we thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg this morning. Another Monday morning talking about Brexit, and another probably 4 weeks talking about Brexit are to come. Anya?
Yeah, Maria, thank you very much. Thanks to Maria Tadeo and also to David O'Sullivan, former EU ambassador to the United States. Interesting to see from the market's positioning, the options market suggesting there is more downside for the pound available on a no deal than there is upside available on any kind of deal being done. We'll watch the market response closely. The pound trades substantially higher this morning. Up next, the results are in. AstraZeneca's coronavirus vaccine prevents, on average, 70% of cases. We'll discuss that with Julia Angeles from Bailey Gifford next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the European Market Open, 43 minutes into the European equity trading session, the first of the week. And of course, we've had some big news to deal with in terms of AstraZeneca. Let's get a Bloomberg First Word News update. Here are your top stories that we're following this morning at Bloomberg. The UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak is committing to increased spending on infrastructure and public services. That's as he seeks to shore up the economy from the impact of the pandemic. To help keep government borrowing down, he's not ruling out a pay freeze for public sector workers.
I can tell you it's a very difficult picture. The economy is experiencing significant stress. We've seen that particularly in the labour market with people's jobs. We know that 750,000 people have tragically already lost their jobs, with forecasts of more to come. Borrowing, we saw the numbers last week at record peacetime levels already, and more stress to come.
World leaders are urging countries not to lose sight of climate goals due to the coronavirus pandemic. They're endorsing the aims of the Paris Agreement amid hopes that US President-elect Joe Biden will rejoin the accord. But President Trump is still slamming the deal, saying it wasn't designed to save the environment, but kill the American economy. South Africa is deeper into junk territory after Moody's and Fitch both lowered the country's credit rating. It comes as the coronavirus is hitting the government's finances and pushing the economy into its longest recession in almost 3 decades. The nation says the downgrades will have an immediate impact on borrowing costs. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. Let's take a look at your movers then. We've got European equity markets as a whole moving to the upside by 0.7%. The FTSE is up by 0.4%. The Xetra DAX gets the best of the gains, up by more than 1%. We've had positive data from the German economy in terms of the PMI numbers looking better than anticipated. And we've had the latest efficacy data out of AstraZeneca. Looking at the movers, you can see the impact of that news on these markets, plus some other news flow. So Cineworld is reacting, of course, to the AstraZeneca news flow, but the share price being up quite so much, up by 19% this morning. They've secured a new debt facility of $450 million. So this importance in terms of their short-term ability to survive the crisis. AstraZeneca, the vaccine, we know is effective in 70% of cases. This is an average. There are various regimens in terms of dosage that you need to look into the detail of, but that's the average. HelloFresh buying factor 75, cuts at underweight at JP Morgan, so HelloFresh moves lower. That and the vaccine news flow moves that particular stock. AstraZeneca's COVID vaccine prevents, as I was saying, on average, 70% of COVID cases, according to initial results of a large trial. That falls short of the bar set by Pfizer and Moderna, whose vaccines were found to be about 95% effective. Let's get into our next conversation about this then. Julia Angeles, Bailey Gifford Fund Manager, joins us now. And Julia, thank you so much and really good to speak to you, given you run a healthcare fund, very important, and to have invested in some of the companies that are running these vaccine trials and trying to produce these vaccines. What's your initial response then when you see data such as what we've got out of AstraZeneca this morning? 70% effectiveness. Is it right to compare that with the over 90% effectiveness we've got from other trials? Are we comparing like with like there?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think the first thing to note that this is really a fantastic news, because if we are to get out of this pandemic, we need more than one vaccine. And we need more than one efficient, effective vaccine against coronavirus. And absolutely, the news from today is an exciting news, even though the data potentially looks relatively less good compared to other companies. But actually, I think on the whole, it's extremely exciting. In terms of whether you can compare, I think it's still too early, because we need to have long-term data to see actually how it affects different age groups, different ethnic groups, and what it does also mean for the long-term protection. So I wouldn't derive too much based on this kind of early data. But overall, I say it's extremely positive news for the world.
Okay, and so then we look at the share prices of AstraZeneca and indeed other pharmaceutical companies today moving lower. That's not then to do with disappointment around any of these tests, is it, Julia? Or is it to do with just selling out of pharmaceutical companies when it starts to look easier to spend our time doing leisure activities, for example? So selling pharma and getting into those more volatile stocks that have been beaten up by the pandemic. Is that what we're seeing today?
Probably, I mean, the way we think about opportunities in investment, we are long-term growth investors, so we don't pay attention really to the short-term volatilities and how market reacts, and they can react on all sorts of news and tend to overreact. The way we see that there is a clear path towards getting the world out of the pandemic, and overall, it's an extremely positive news. And the company actually who driving that progress, it's not so much large pharma companies, it's those younger biotech companies that have novel technologies. I mean, we have a collaboration with Pfizer and BioNTech. Technology actually comes from BioNTech, which is a German-based company. So for me, it's actually the longer term opportunities, I see them more in the younger innovative businesses, and that's the way I would look at it.
Okay, and so when you're looking for those new exciting opportunities, Julia, and you look at the success of mRNA vaccinations in fighting COVID-19, or at least in the trial data that we've seen, do you get excited? Obviously, that is excited for the world at large, but from an investor perspective, are you very excited about what we can use mRNA for next? What are the new uses for this methodology, this type of vaccination for cancer, for example? Has this really been a game changer?
No, absolutely. The reason why we invested in Moderna, it's not for the COVID-19 vaccine. We've been investors in Moderna since IPOs that happened 2 years ago. And we've been really excited about the potential of the technology overall to add an entirely new class of medicine that can address a really wide range of different diseases. And as you mentioned correctly, oncology is one of the areas where we're able to program for patient-specific cancer profile. So this is genuinely unique technology. And what is really exciting about messenger RNA, there is genuinely no limitations how you can apply this technology. And what Moderna has done incredibly well, it really approached that technology almost like from engineering point of view, it tried to de-risk in every single application, the technology side. And as soon as it's de-risked, it's tried to pile other applications through that technology. And prophylactic vaccines with COVID-19, that's the greatest example why Moderna actually succeeded that, because they've already been running a lot of trials within prophylactic vaccines. And that allowed them to move really fast and be one of the fastest companies to take this program into the clinic.
Another thing we're watching very closely, Julia, of course, is the US election and the results there. Julia, do you expect to see downward pressure on prices as a result of the US election, or is a tied Senate, if that's what we end up with in January, is that going to limit the ability of the Democrats to change pricing?
I think the pricing is really, really big topic, and it tends to be hugely politicized. But actually, the true innovation would always need to be rewarded. And I don't see that, the companies like Moderna and those who really try to take the cost out of the system and deliver genuine value to improve patients' outcomes. I don't think those companies going to be at risk of pricing pressures. But certainly any bad behaviors in the industry will need to be addressed. But I would say that the regulation will need to happen from bottom up rather than top down if we are to encourage innovation in the industry. And I just hope that the common sense will win. And with the new government in the US, I'm quite optimistic.
Julia, thanks very much for your time. Really good, timely conversation to have with you. Julia Angeles, Bailey Gifford Fund Manager, thank you very much for joining us. Up next on the programme, will the US 10-year yield trade first at 0.6% or at 1%? Does the news out of AstraZeneca today influence your call on that? We'll put that question to Market Live's Eddie van der Velde next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the European Market Open, 55 minutes into our trading day. Let's talk to the Markets Live team. Eddie van der Walt joins us now, Markets Live editor. Eddie, good morning to you. I know your macro view this morning, you've been talking about gold's position looking precarious. Is that because of better vaccine news, or what's the story?
Yeah, I think gold just simply got itself a little bit too extended. Gold has had a fantastic run up. Back in late 2018, we were sitting at 1,200. And then earlier this year, we peaked out at 2,000. Much of that was vaccine, much of that was lower rates. But I think it also simply was just the market just getting exuberant and people getting excited about gold. That's faded a little bit now. We're seeing outflows in ETFs and other markets. And I think gold's outlook is a bit precarious at the moment.
And just briefly, Eddie, your thoughts on the question of the day: 10-year yield, 0.6% or 1%? Which one do they head for?
It's such a tough one. Betting against lower yields is betting against a trend that's lasted since 1985. But I do think in the short term, I think the steepening continues as markets start opening up and so on.
Eddie, thank you so much. Really good to speak to you this morning. Eddie van der Walt, Markets Live editor. Thanks very much for your thoughts on gold, on the bond markets. Lots to talk about this morning then. We have had the results of AstraZeneca's trial. The Oxford University team say they are very pleased with those results. 70% efficacy might not compare favourably to what we heard from Pfizer and Moderna, but it has other big advantages. And if you look at certain dosage regimes, you do get to much higher efficacy levels. Lots more to talk about on that subject on Bloomberg Radio next, and here on TV on Bloomberg Surveillance. This is Bloomberg.
The results are in. AstraZeneca's coronavirus vaccine prevents on average 70% of cases, falling short of the high bar set by Pfizer and Moderna. Tougher tiers ahead. Boris Johnson will outline the UK's winter strategy today. The measures are expected to include a big increase in community testing and more stringent rules post-lockdown. And the new cabinet, Bloomberg learns that President-elect Joe Biden has landed on longtime advisor Antony Blinken as his Secretary of State. Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. We have quite a lot of data coming in. The PMIs are coming in. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. So let's break those PMI numbers and then go straight to the markets to have a look at some of the positive news out there and how market traders are actually taking this. Now, Euro area non-services PMI falling to 41.3. That's a touch worse than expected. The forecast was a 42 figure, and then manufacturing PMI is a touch better than expected. Interesting to see the differences between services and manufacturing, but overall, if you look at what the markets wants to focus on, I guess it's the Astra-Oxford vaccine, preventing on average 70% of COVID cases. And then in general, global stocks are actually advancing. I'm looking at oil, it's also up. They're focusing on the encouraging news that we had from vaccines across the world. This one, the AstraZeneca one, done with Oxford, is not as efficacious as some of the other ones, but actually you have to keep it at a much higher temperature, which would mean distribution could be that much easier. So not all discouraging news. Let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Good morning, Francine. Over in the US, President-elect Joe Biden is planning to name longtime aide Antony Blinken as Secretary of State, the nation's top diplomat. That's according to several Bloomberg sources. Former Hillary Clinton aide Jake Sullivan is expected to be National Security Advisor. An announcement could come as soon as tomorrow. Now, UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak is committing to increase spending on infrastructure and public services. That's as he seeks to shore up the economy from the impact of the pandemic. To help keep government borrowing down, he is not ruling out a pay freeze for public sector workers.
I can tell you it's a very difficult picture. The economy is experiencing significant stress. We've seen that particularly in the labour market with people's jobs. We know that 750,000 people have tragically already lost their jobs, with forecasts of more to come. Borrowing, we saw the numbers last week, at record peacetime levels already, and more stress to come.
And South Africa is deeper into junk territory after Moody's and Fitch both lowered the country's credit rating. It comes as the coronavirus is hitting the government's finances and pushing the economy into its longest recession in almost 3 decades. The nation says the downgrades will have an immediate impact on borrowing costs. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now, AstraZeneca's COVID vaccine prevents on average 70% of COVID cases. That's according to the initial results of a large trial. Now, that does fall short of the bar set by Pfizer and Moderna, whose vaccines were found to be 95% effective. Well, joining us now is Sam Fazeli. He's Bloomberg Intelligence EMEA Research Director. Sam, great to speak to you as always. Now, I'm a little bit confused about the difference between 70% of efficacy by this Astra-Oxford vaccine when you give 2 doses, but 90% when you give half a dose and then another dose. So do we assume that actually it's the 90% efficacy because that's how they will administer it?
No. Good morning, Francine. I don't think we should assume anything like that. I'm actually a bit surprised that the company put those numbers in there. We'll have to see what the statistical design of this trial was, but I would caution and run with the 70% number. That 90%, where it comes from, it was a much smaller group of patients that they reported it on. It doesn't make any sense why half a dose should be more effective. So there's lots of questions that I would apply to that. So frankly, for now, I would ignore it and stick with 70%.
Okay, so if we stick with the 70%, what does it tell us about how this vaccine will be used compared to the other 2 ones that were much more effective? They're new vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer one. Will there be less people wanting to take those?
Well, so that's a problem, right? If you were offered, I wrote a little story to a friend I turned up at the doctor and he said, Sam, your lucky day today, you're going to get a vaccine. It's the Astra vaccine. Go home, come back in 4 weeks' time, take your second shot. Then I'll tell you if you're immune or not. And you've got a 70%, let's say it's a 70% chance, which is, so, how would I feel about that? So that's a problem. And then, of course, you've got the issue that, on the other hand, vaccines don't get id of pandemics. A sage person who runs the WHO said, vaccinations do. So getting a 70% vaccine, which is much easier to transport, and many more doses available, may actually be quite a useful thing while we're managing the pandemic.
Sam, who's going to get what? Are countries now trying to negotiate, or has that already been done about what's available and how soon can we get these vaccines?
Yes, so a lot of that's already negotiated, and frankly, we will not have enough doses from any single company to deal with the problems of any single country. I'm just about to put out another piece of research that looks at who is dependent on the Astra vaccine to get their pandemic under control, and the UK and EU do show up there. They need this vaccine to have worked better, perhaps. And of course, many of the other countries not part of the developed, richer nations rely a lot more on it.
All right, Sam, thank you so much. Sam Fazeli there, Bloomberg Intelligence EMEA Research Director. Now, joining us this morning to talk about the impact of the vaccines on the markets is Peter Garner. He's head of equity strategy at Saxo Bank. Peter, it seems that, day in, day out, the market either focuses on a vaccine and the encouraging news, or they focus on the fact that in the short term, we could still see another hit. Today, they're focusing on the vaccine. What exactly is priced in?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the market has difficulties pricing in what to expect for 2021. I'm leaning towards that the market over time will increase its bets on pro-cyclical industries and actually becoming more and more positive. I remain very optimistic that we will get this vaccine out very broadly next year, and we'll see a massive effect on the economy, and we still can see more support coming from monetary authorities, but also on the fiscal side, specifically China. We think is running a very tight financial condition, especially on the monetary side, and we think China will move the needle when we get on the other side of the new year, and that will give a much bigger boost to Asia, which will have a positive impact on the global economy and especially Europe, which is very deep trading links to Asia. So I remain very optimistic, and when I look at the global equity market, we're having a free cash flow yield of 5 to 6%. I think that's very attractive given what you're offered in many different other asset classes, for instance, corporate bonds.
Peter, what does that mean for normalization either of fiscal policy or monetary policy? And have the markets latched onto that? That actually could we see a bout of inflation at this point?
So this is the absolutely key thing to think about if you're an investor, is that will there be a policy mistake? Because there are these lead and lagging effects. So the vaccine news are definitely leading, and the market should reflect that. At the same time, on the ground, you're seeing businesses and bankruptcies that actually could go up over the next 3 to 4, 5 months. You also have the lending programs in the U.S., uncertainty about social transfers in the U.S., how big can they be under a new Biden administration, etc. And because of these lead lagging effects, there could be a situation where policymakers move both in Europe and the U.S. With a big bazooka, and then, as the leading indicators, the vaccines actually normalize it, and they normalize much faster than expected, then you have made a very big dose of stimulus to the economy, and then suddenly we could get inflation. We're still leaning towards that it's not something we expect until the second half of next year, and potentially it could be something for 2022. So as we as we move closer to the new year, we remain very bullish on equities, and in particular we like emerging market equities because of the the center around South Korea, China, Taiwan, and India that really seems to be improving fast.
But Peter, how do you protect yourself against a possible bout of inflation? I don't know whether that's your base case for mid-2021.
I don't think investors should. You're not in a hurry. We personally believe you're not in a hurry to really protect yourself against inflation over the next 6 months. But it's definitely a theme to build your portfolios around going forward. And it's very tricky. Historically speaking, when we have looked at this from data, equities actually tend to do quite well unless you get sustained inflation above 4%. That's when it gets very critical. The problem is that the last very high inflationary regime we had was back in the 70s, and the composition of the companies and the industries that are more prevailing in the equity markets today are much different. So it's not very, very easy. But what you have to look for as an investor is you have to look for companies that you believe have a bargaining power against either their suppliers or consumers, depending on where they are in the supply chain. So you have to go with companies most likely that have a dominating market position. That would be our guess on where to set up at least the individual securities, where to hedge best against inflation. But then you can also put on macro bets, and we really like inflation-linked bonds as a balance in your portfolio. You could also have a little bit of gold, but also long volatility components we think will actually be quite critical in the years to come.
Peter, what do you do with China? So China's a big winner of 2020. I don't know whether that's your case, although there's concerns about possible defaults and a couple of bond stories out there. But how do you play China?
There's different ways of playing China. What we like about China, if you want to invest in China, is it's the healthcare, it's the consumer markets, and it's the technology. We think the policy implementation from China, antitrust curbs on the big technology companies, we don't think they will meaningfully curb the innovation or the market power of these big technology companies in China, at least not in the short term. So we prefer those three sectors. You should probably invest directly in the A shares of the Chinese market and do your security selection directly, because you have to go for high quality in that market. It's a very speculative market. There's a lot of companies that are listed in China which don't have very high quality, so you have to do that. But we remain very positive on the Chinese equity market, both in terms of valuation, the growth outlook. We think is much better, and as I said, we think China will move on stimulus, both on the fiscal side, but most importantly on the monetary side when we get into the new year, and that will lift Chinese equities against the rest of the world. And then also more foreign investors are actually waking up to the Chinese market. It's 50% of the emerging markets index, and it's getting more and more important.
Peter, thank you so much. Peter Garnery there from Saxo Bank. He stays with us. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more on the European economy. Also a conversation, exclusive conversation, with the French Finance Minister, Bruno Le Maire. That's around 11 a.m. London time. And this is Bloomberg.
is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, there's a lot going on in the markets. Of course, we had news about this vaccine just moments ago. Whatever you need to know today is, of course, the efficacy of this vaccine. It was clearly explained by Sam Fazeli. 70% is exactly what they're looking at. And we're also being updated and briefed, reporters certainly are, by Menelas Pacanalos. He's Executive Vice President of Biopharmaceuticals, and he's saying that the vaccine will have big impact around the world. This is because of the way you ship it and the distribution, which is easier than some of their other vaccines. And they also say that they're planning to start supplying the vaccine by year end. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Good morning, Francine. And as Francine just mentioned, the COVID-19 vaccine from Oxford University and AstraZeneca prevents an average of 70% of COVID cases, below the high bar set by Pfizer and Moderna. One of the dosing regimes offers 90% protection. The other offers less effective. The big advantage of this vaccine is that it can be stored at a refrigerated temperature. Now, Blackstone is doubling down on Asia. Sources tell Bloomberg it's seeking to raise at least $5 billion for its second private equity fund focused on the region. That is more than double the size of its first. Deal flows are starting to pick up, and investors are keen on the region as it's recovering faster from coronavirus. And women in finance are much less likely to be promoted unless they actually ask for it. That's according to a new study in Australia. It says over 3/4 of men have been offered a promotion without asking. That compares with just 57% for women. The report also says male fund managers on average earn more than twice as much as women. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now let's focus on the UK and on Europe. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, said he's hopeful that Brexit talks will end in a constructive place. Meanwhile, Sky News reports that EU officials think a deal is now 95% agreed. So how should investors position for 2021? Well, still with us is Peter Conry from Saxo Bank. Peter, how much time do you still spend looking at the implication for equities?
I don't spend that much time, to be honest, on the Brexit. Our view is that it has become quite a circus over the years, and in the end, probably 5 minutes to 12, they will get a deal done, and Europe will move forward. And I think actually over time it will become a good thing for the UK. There will be more certainty, and I think there will be a big jump in investments, and we can all get along. I don't think it's a big thing for me. When I'm looking ahead, I'm more worried about, so one thing, is this rotation from growth and technology stocks into value, is it credible? Is that something that we should advise our clients to do? That's number one. Or two, which growth industries or themes do we want our clients to be exposed to in 2021? Those two things I'm more obsessed about, to be honest.
Okay, so, you know, given the two things that you're obsessed about, what do you do with treasuries? I know you focus on equity, but this big rotation that we saw, will it continue?
Yeah, so that's back to the vaccine news, and where do interest rates go from here? That's the key question. I think we had the initial response, and everyone was excited. Maybe we're getting a rotation into value stocks. We're a little bit more hesitant, to be honest. I think we need a very firm breakout of the 10-year Treasury yield above 1 or 1.1% to really be confident that that's where we're going. We're still overweight and leaning towards growth and technology. We like that more than value stocks. Value stocks are, to us, really an interest rate play. Energy and financials are a big part of that, and energy has a lot of excess oil inventories, and I think there's still a lot of uncertainty around how big demand will be on mobility in 2021. So I think there's still a lot of headwinds for value. So we're sticking with high growth industries, including e-commerce and software, as something to be exposed to as an investor. Also because from first principles, if you look at the largest companies in the world in the equity market, they have per definition been high growth industries. So we think it's much more interesting to look at what will come or what will become the biggest trends over the coming decade. It's far more interesting than trying to pick the small nuances in the market.
But Peter, the big trend, is it just, do we return back to normal? How much scarring is there in the economy? Or do we just push ahead with the technology?
Well, I think it will be a combination of the both. I don't think they exclude each other. I think we'll get a normalization of the economy by mid next year. And then, as I said, mobility demand will probably be something for the second half. We'll still have to see how many people will get flexible work in the US and Europe after we normalize with the vaccine being distributed. So there's still a lot of uncertainties around that. But in terms of growth, that is what we really recommend our clients. And in terms of the value stocks and the interest rates, as I said, we're looking for that 1.1% dividend yield. But I think it's a very big difference whether we get a very big shot up in interest rates or it's more gradual. If it's gradual, I actually think that growth stocks will not be hit that much from high interest rates. We've typically seen that you need to go beyond 2.5% before it's really bad for growth stocks. So I'm not that particularly worried, to be honest.
All right, Peter, thank you so much. Peter Garnery, there, head of equity strategy at Saxo Bank, and with all of the insight and analysis. Now, coming up, President-elect Joe Biden begins to assemble his cabinet, even though Donald Trump has yet to concede. We'll have plenty more on that shortly, and this is Bloomberg.
the president's legal team has been a national embarrassment. I voted for him twice, but elections have consequences, and we cannot continue to act as if something happened here that didn't happen. You have an obligation to present the evidence. The evidence has not been presented, and you must conclude, as Tucker Carlson even concluded the other night, that if you're unwilling to come forward and present the evidence, it must mean the evidence doesn't exist.
Well, that was the Trump ally and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie talking about President Trump's string of losses in court as he still fights the results of the general election. Now, this weekend, more Republicans came out and said it's time for Trump to start the transition to President-elect Biden. Now, we're just getting a bit more breaking news out of AstraZeneca. Again, so Oxford researchers say the half-dose result came as a surprise. We spoke to our Sam Fazeli, who was trying to set the record straight about the efficacy of this new vaccine. This is Bloomberg.
Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
I was actually poor.
No foreplay?
Eat your bag of Lay's with a smile on your face.
If all the diseases have been taken, I'll take a tax.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. The US is hoping to start vaccinations against COVID-19 in less than 3 weeks. The head of the government's Operation Warp Speed told CNN it plans to begin in mid-December. By May, he wants 70% of Americans immunized, adding most people will need the shot before life can get back to normal. Now, the UK may greenlight Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine in less than a week. That's according to the Telegraph. Draft plans show the UK will start vaccinations from December the 1st. Every adult in the country could get the jab by April. But the paper says health officials are warning it's too early to commit to a timetable. A small but growing number of Republicans are saying it's now time for President Donald Trump to start the transition. The administration's latest challenge to the results in Pennsylvania has been rejected. The judge, known as a conservative Republican, called it a Frankenstein's monster that lacked evidence. The president is now appealing that decision. And world leaders are urging countries not to lose sight of climate goals due to the coronavirus pandemic. They're endorsing aims of the Paris Agreement amid hopes that US President-elect Joe Biden will rejoin the accord. But President Trump is still slamming the deal, saying it wasn't designed to save the environment but kill the American economy. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much for just getting a bit of data out of the UK for the month of November. Manufacturing PMI is at 55.2. That's better than expected. The number that economists were expecting were 50.5. So, of course, anything above 50 is also expansionary. Now, let's focus on the economies of the euro area. Within the last half an hour, November's flash PMI reading showed the economy dropping into contraction, coming in at 45.1. Meanwhile, a standoff with Hungary and Poland over the EU's budget plans and recovery package shows no sign of resolution. Well, joining us today to talk about all these things is Silvia Merler, Head of Research at Algebrai's Policy and Research Forum. Thank you so much, Silvia, for joining us today. First of all, I guess the big thorny issue for the EU is what's the workaround to make sure that they can still have the recovery fund without Poland and Hungary involved?
So, never a dull moment in Brussels, as you were anticipating. The standoff on the EU budget becomes even more salient and important in light of the PMI data that you mentioned for the Eurozone today, and within the Eurozone, particularly for France, more than Germany. So the risk that really the divergence that we were fearing in the recovery after the COVID-19 crisis becomes reality. So for now, the strategy seems to be to try and bridge a compromise with Hungary and Poland. There are doubts to whether this will be successful because Hungary and Poland do not really need the money from the recovery fund that much, being significant net beneficiary from the EU budget even regularly. So the countries that really need the recovery funds are countries that would either be net contributors to the EU budget, like Italy, or net beneficiary, but significantly less than the Eastern European countries like Spain. There are a number of options that could be tried to go forward with the proposal without having to count in the vote from Hungary and Poland. There's an option to go for enhanced cooperation under the EU treaty, or there would be an option to go even more nuclear, so to say, and take the proposal out of the EU budget completely and go for an intergovernmental separate treaty similar to the one that we have for the ESM. They're both possible options. Clearly, they're not optimal because they would signal a failure on the political side to really engage on this federalization of expenditures that really was the big step in this whole recovery fund discussion, but it can be done. So I wouldn't be too worried about complete failure of the negotiations there.
Silvia, talk to me a bit about the timeline. How important is it that actually gets done quickly, and how much of a hindrance will it be if it doesn't get done fast?
So theoretically, the part of the budget of the package that they are opposing, it's the own resources decision. It is a very specific part of the package. It is necessary for the European Commission, for the European Union to go out on the market and issue the 750 billion that will be needed to finance the next generation EU package. Because it is only needed for the issuance, theoretically you could actually wait. So you don't need it right now to be able to approve the budget. It is just the fact that other countries will want the certainty that this will happen before committing to approving the rest of the budget, basically, which is where Hungary and Poland will get the most money from. So it is really a sequencing issue more than a definite timeline issue. You could get, theoretically, the budget passed by the end of December, even without having the own resources decision in place. However, the point is that countries are not going to commit to approving the budget without knowing that the own resources decision will be in place. So this is basically a discussion that proceeds in parallel. In terms of timing, we already know that the first disbursement of the funds was not going to come before spring 2021. So in terms of the speed of disbursement, it doesn't really change that much. Even if negotiations were to stretch out a little bit on the own resources decision in the early part of 2021, it would not be, I think, dramatic in the sense that it wouldn't change the schedule of disbursement so much. The problem is the uncertainty that this is going to create for countries that have been hit very hard from COVID and are not getting much money from the EU budget if the recovery fund is not approved.
Yeah. Sylvia, what do you make of these vaccines? So, you know, if we can get a certain percentage of the population vaccinated pretty quickly, is there a danger that the policy mix then is not quite right because central banks will still do more? We heard, you know, Christine Lagarde being very cautious about the vaccines. So could we see sudden rampant inflation mid-2021?
Well, I think there's two things going opposite direction. So you're right in monetary policy, ECB, Lagarde, but also other like Schnabel and other governing council members have been very cautious in the public speeches that they've made or in whatever things they have written and published online. The idea that a vaccine would be there in 2021 was already factored into the September forecast from the ECB. So what will really changes December, I think, taking more into account the effect of lockdowns for the second wave across Europe, which is what we are also starting to see in the PMIs, especially France. So that goes in that direction. The mobility and the second wave go in the direction of depressing the economy further. So I think, at least for initially in 2021, considering also the logistical issues of deploying mass vaccination, it is unlikely that we will see rampant inflation coming up.
Do you worry longer term that actually when the ECB steps out of some of these programs, you know, yields will kind of go crazy and that will put a lot of pressure on certain countries?
I think a key question there, which we haven't really answered yet, is how much of this shock is going to be structural and how much is going to just be cyclical and be reabsorbed and how fast. And the big question there is even if you look at China, which is the country that has had the fastest recovery, and at least for now, no foreseeable second wave, still the economy is going back to this 95% economy that we keep hearing about. So it feels like there's a portion of the economy that either you don't get back to unless you have the vaccine, or is definitely lost, meaning there is a structural destruction of potential. Your potential output becomes lower. So I think that is really the one unknown in economic analysis term that we don't yet, that we haven't really understood well about this crisis. And in Europe, I think that's even more important because it's likely going to be asymmetric across country. So understanding what will happen in the longer term, I think really requires answering this question of whether there is going to be a destruction of potential and how unevenly distributed that is going to be, especially in Europe across countries, and whether it risks resuming that divergence and that heterogeneity that we actually had managed to reabsorb after the Eurozone crisis by realigning the financial cycles across Eurozone countries.
Sylvia, thank you so much for joining us. Sylvia Merler there, Head of Research at Algebrai's Policy and Research Forum. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more, of course, on the European economy. We'll also talk coffee shortly. We'll be speaking to Andrea Illy for an exclusive conversation on announcement over the weekend about a partnership with private equity. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Good morning, Francine. The COVID-19 vaccine from Oxford University and AstraZeneca prevents an average of 70% of COVID cases, below the high bar set by Pfizer and Moderna. One of the doses regimes offers 90% protection. The other is less effective. The big advantage of this vaccine is that it can be stored at a refrigerator temperature. Now, Abu Dhabi is investing over $120 billion in oil and natural gas over the next 5 years. That's as it seeks to raise production capacity, even as OPEC is restricting its output. Last week, it even privately floated the idea it could leave the cartel, potentially destabilizing oil markets. Blackstone is doubling down on Asia. Sources tell Bloomberg it's seeking to raise at least $5 billion for its second private equity fund focused on the region. That's more than double the size of its first. Deal flows are starting to pick up, and investors are keen on the region as it's recovering faster from coronavirus. And women in finance are much less likely to be promoted unless they actually ask for it. That's according to a new study in Australia. It says over 3/4 of men have been offered a promotion without asking. That compares with just 57% for women. The report also says male fund managers on average earn more than twice as much as women. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now, Illy Café is set to sell a minority stake to New York-based private equity firm Rhone Capital. One of Italy's largest coffee roasters, Illy has been growing its network of cafes on shopping streets in recent years. Now, the latest move will see the company expand its presence in the U.S. market, taking on Starbucks in its home territory. Well, joining us now is Andrea Illy. He's the chair of Illy Café. Andrea Illy, as always, thank you so much for joining us, as, of course, most of us drink a lot more coffee, but just differently at home. Does Rhone at the moment have an option to increase their stake down the line, or is it capped?
It is capped, but the details of the deal are not finalized yet, also because the agreement is subject to an authorizing process. So the details are still unknown. What we can say is that, yes, we deliberated to open our equity to Rhone as a preferred partner, because Rhone allows us to, let's say, pursue the U.S. expansion as originally foreseen when we decided to give a mandate to Goldman Sachs 1 year ago. And at the same time, Rhone is in the capacity to further professionalize our family business, make it really become hopefully a world-class organization, so that it will facilitate also the generational change.
Andrea, how competitive was the process of selling a stake of Illy? Were there other people involved? Were other bidders wanted to take a stake in Illy?
Oh, yes, there have been many, many interested bidders. The process has been also impacted by COVID, and this also made required to reshuffle the business objectives, because in the meantime, the company suffered the closing of so many restaurants, cafes, offices, and airlines, transportation, let's say, companies where we used to have our core business. We very quickly refocused our core business into the home channel, thanks to 4 very large investments, one in branding, the second in the digital transformation, allowing us to serve directly the consumer, and the third in the new compatible capsule, the licensing agreement with GTE, and last but not least, revitalizing the modern trade channel. So this allows us now to have a very solid business model in the home consumption, in the channels, omni-channel for home consumption. And the plan is to invest in the largest coffee market in the world, which is the United States, thanks to our new partner, Rhone.
So is that why you went for Rhone in the end? What was the difference between Rhone and some of the other contenders?
Rhone is a kind of a tailor-made suit for us because it is a fund with a extreme experience in minority investments in family business, particularly Italian family business, and their strategy is transatlantic. So helping European companies to better penetrate the United States of America. So this is a smaller funds compared to the big the giants, let's say. So also the chain of command, the governance is much more accessible and allows us to have a kind of a personal approach with the founder. And this is also very positive because it's a relationship similar to one you could have with a family office.
Andrea, would you consider an IPO if it's successful and if you are successful in growing in the US with Rhone?
This is part of the details of the deal that we are going to disclose once the authorizing process is finished, and as well as other details. The exit is to be announced.
So what can you tell
soon?
Yeah. Okay, so you'll have to come back on soon, or maybe give us a bit of a breaking news or glimpse. What will you do with the proceeds that you get from the stake sale?
Proceeds will be used also to pay out one of the brothers in the holding, in the single, let's say, shareholder, which is the Gruppo Illy, is our family holding. And one of the brothers decided to withdraw. And so the proceeds will be used also to pay him out.
How much, going back to the coffee market and the fact that, you know, I'm at home, you're at home at the moment, and we're drinking coffees from our living rooms, how much does that make up for the lost revenue from cafes and lockdown? And if we have a vaccine, do you expect people to go back to coffee shops fairly quickly?
Yes, I'm optimistic. Whenever you have this change, if you remember when we had September 11, nobody was flying anymore. But since then, the airlines business did explode. Yes, it is part due to globalization and the new low costs, but this is because mainly there is more trust in the system, in the safety of flying. So I expect that once the society will be structured in a way to prevent pandemics and contagions, there will be possibly even a boom of out-of-home consumption. So I'm optimistic, although it's more prudent to take into consideration less consumption out of home. Things like smart working is more efficient independently from the pandemic. So this will, in general, I think, reshuffle a little bit the world consumption and economy.
What's your biggest challenge, do you think, in growing in the US? Is it brand recognition? Is it something else? And how will you decide on whether to IPO or not?
Well, Illy is in the United States since nearly 40 years or so. We are considered to be nearly American. We know the market pretty well. It is true that we have been capable of working in the niche of the super premium, let's say, part of the business. Now it's time to penetrate the market a little bit more in, let's say, segments which are more in the premium segments, and this requires a more sophisticated business approach, more, let me say, American business approach. We really cannot be continue doing business in the United States with the European way. It's a two different culture, and we need to Americanize ourselves. This is the challenge, without compromises our heritage, without compromising our Italian roots. So balancing these two cultures is the challenge.
And on the IPO, what will make you decide whether to IPO or not?
Well, the IPO is the natural, good question, you come back, is the natural, let's say, decision for a family business which wants to be a world-class organization. So sooner or later there will be an IPO, definitely, but it's not yet the moment to decide to know whether it will be in the medium term or in the long term.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Andrea Illy there, the chairman of Illy Cafe, with an exclusive conversation. Now, coming up, of course, we'll look at the day ahead. The DAX 30 could become the DAX 40. Yet the results of a review into Germany's benchmark stock index come out today, so we'll look ahead. Actually, they're out tomorrow, so today we look ahead to that. This is Bloomberg.
Climate change is the defining issue of our time, so we've redefined how we cover it. With clear data and rigorous journalism, we rise to the scale of the challenge to reveal the breadth of possibility. We look at stories from every angle to provoke debate, spotlight solutions, and make sense of the greatest crisis of our generation. Bloomberg Green, solutions for a changing climate.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, a lot going on in the markets. A lot of the focus, of course, is on what we've seen with the AstraZeneca-Oxford vaccine. Now, here are some of the other things we're watching this week. Tomorrow, look out for the results of a review of the DAX 30. On Wednesday, the Hong Kong chief executive, Carrie Lam, delivers her annual policy address. Also on Wednesday, we get the latest FOMC minutes from the Fed and an update on GDP. And it's handbanked.
day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
The results are in. AstraZeneca's coronavirus vaccine prevents on average 70% of cases, falling short of the high bar set by Pfizer and Moderna. Tougher tiers ahead. Boris Johnson will outline the UK's winter strategy today. The measures could include a big increase in community testing and more stringent rules post-lockdown. And the new cabinet, Bloomberg learns that President-elect Joe Biden has landed on longtime advisor Anthony Blinken as his Secretary of State. Well, good morning, everyone, and happy Monday. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lack in London, Tom Keane in New York. Tom, I know it's Thanksgiving week, so we look also at retail sales, and then we look at what the Fed, but it's a shorter week for a lot of American traders. The focus in Europe is firmly on the vaccines, Tom, and the fact that we had some pretty encouraging news over the last 10 days or so. First, it started with Moderna, then Pfizer, and AstraZeneca is not as efficient as the others, but actually doesn't need those freezing temperatures to be transported, and it could also be a cheaper option.
Yeah, we're going to talk to Sam Fazeli about that, Francine. I really take issue with the complaints about AstraZeneca. That's sort of a normal reading where the others were spectacular. Over here, it's about the hospitalization, Francine. It's been an extraordinary, difficult pandemic weekend. America tries to move on, and someone moving on is the president-elect with the news from Bloomberg overnight on appointments to be had, I believe, Tuesday, even while the president contests in Wisconsin.
Yeah, we'll have a full roundup of the U.S. elections as well. Let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Morning, Francine, Tom. Another promising development in the fight to end the coronavirus pandemic. A vaccine developed by the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca prevented a majority of people in a large trial from getting the disease. It stopped an average of 70% from falling ill. That's below the high bar set by Pfizer and Moderna, but effectiveness did rise to 90% for one of two dosing regimes. Joe Biden plans to name longtime advisor Anthony Blinken as Secretary of State. When Biden was vice president, Blinken served as his national security advisor and later deputy secretary of state. Bloomberg's learned that former Hillary Clinton aide Jake Sullivan is likely to be named national security advisor. And the Trump administration will reportedly ban tech exports to 89 Chinese aerospace and other companies. Reuters says the companies have ties to the Chinese military. It's a move that could escalate tensions as the Biden administration prepares to take over. And in the UK, Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak said he will increase spending on public services this week. He's trying to shore up the economy in the midst of a resurgence of the coronavirus. The focus of Sunak's spending review on Wednesday will be the pandemic. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Thanks so much, Ritika. Nice lift to the markets this morning as we look at equities, bonds, currencies. We're up at 22 on S&P 500. The VIX doesn't show me much right now, 23.38. We'll see how that goes. Yields higher, really just back within range. I don't want to make too much of that. Oil's a story. We had 46 on Brent, 45.78 right now. West Texas 43.09 American oil. And the currency market is fascinating. We have continued dollar weakness, yen 103.79, and sterling. I mean, Francine's living large, folks. We had a 134 print earlier. Right now, 133.71. Francine, why is sterling stronger?
Well, Tom, it's very clear that actually, there's more upbeat about a potential deal on Brexit. But if you look at sterling, it still remains, the victim of Brexit-related headlines, with options suggesting that a deal is largely priced in. So you're right, cable did rise to the strongest since early September, and at the same time, demand for puts are staying strong across, with the front end better bid for dollar topside. So something that we've been talking to analysts about, and certainly I've been spending a bit of time on. Overall, the market seems to be pleased with the vaccine news. There's a bit of a lift to the market, but really there's not huge news out there, Tom, given also it's a shorter week over in the U.S. Now, to talk about sterling, to talk about dollar, and anything in between is Jeremy Stretch. He's CIBC head of G10 FX strategy. Jeremy, what do you do with pound right now? And good morning.
Optimism or the good news is already baked in vis-a-vis the Brexit story. There's been discussion over the weekend that perhaps the legal text is now 95% complete. Of course, I would remind you that it is that last 5%, it is the real structural problem, because of course those are the thornier issues which we need to see resolved. But nevertheless, I think we are seeing sterling having some degree of upside impetus, but I think it is getting close to an opportunity to start to sell those rallies, because I think there are still inherent issues in the context of UK PLC. We'll see that writ large when we see the Chancellor announcing his spending review on Wednesday, but more importantly, we'll see that writ large in terms of the degree of economic destruction evidenced in the forecasts. So I think it is very much the case that the leverage community, I think, will start to fade these sterling rallies, and I think anything anywhere near the sort of 134.5 to 135 level in cable, I think is a good level to short, even against the backdrop where you are expecting the US dollar to be a generalized underperformer.
Jeremy, what happens if we don't have a Brexit deal?
Well, of course, that is the uncertainty that we're all dealing with. It is, as we get to this late stage, still the central case scenario. At least it has been from the CIBC perspective for a prolonged period that we would see a deal. But of course, if there is no deal, then we start to dust off those discussions about what the ramifications would be in terms of the macro performance for the UK under WTO trade terms. Now, the optimists would say, well, it's not that different to the sort of Brexit that is potentially being negotiated, but nevertheless, I think investors would certainly view that as a very negative scenario. So I think we could easily see a fairly substantial retreat back into sterling, not back to the sort of low 120s, but I think we could certainly see a several big figure reversal, because I think markets are generally anticipating now that there will be a resolution and there will be a skinny free trade deal agreed, which, as I say, won't obviate all of the economic challenges for the UK, but will neverthelest avoid that worst case scenario of WTO tendencies.
Jeremy, good morning. Let's start with Monday, first principle tendencies. Is it an interest rate play or is it a flow play? What is driving major pair foreign exchange right now?
Good morning, Tom. Well, I think it is a general sort of flow-based story. I think there are increased levels of optimism, and it is interesting that this is the third Monday in a row where we've sat down with positive vaccine news, and that, of course, is to be definitely commended. And I think we are seeing this gradual realization that the dawning of a vaccine-related era is coming that much closer. Now, of course, we hope there aren't going to be any impediments to that, but nevertheless, that vaccine-related optimism, I think, is encouraging ongoing flows into those higher risk and emerging market currencies. So that is continuing the broader based theme. And then set against that, you also still have this realization that with a lack of fiscal stimulus evident in the US, then that probably still leaves a significant degree of onus on the Federal Reserve. So I think that's also playing into the narrative of the US dollar being a general underperformer. So I think it's a backdrop of dollar underperformance. Euro will perhaps struggle and perhaps be used more as a carry trade or a short leg of the carry trade. But ultimately, I think it's that higher risk or higher beta currencies which will continue to be performing well.
Jeremy, we rip up the script when things move, and one of the big moves happened moments ago, folks. We've had stronger Mexican peso with EM over the last number number of weeks, and we just had really, it's sort of like Dow 10,000, having Mexican peso breach 20, 24, 23, 21, down to 20, and we finally come back down and get a 19 print on peso. How did that happen, Jeremy Stretch? Is it just enthusiasm for EM?
Well, I think it is, and I think I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the residue of this U.S. presidential election is obviously very different to the previous one, when of course Mexico was very much front and center. But I think if we are in an environment where EM nations are going to perform relatively well, or you were looking for those higher beta risks, and you were looking for a little bit of yield, then it has been evident that Mexico has been looking reasonably attractive. So you're absolutely right. We've seen a substantial move lower, and I was talking to our spot trader this morning, who's been running this trade from the short side, looking for dollar MEX to go lower. But he's also, I think, mindful that this psychological barrier will prove to be one which might be an opportunity just to lighten up some positions. So I think it may well be the case that we've seen a very solid run for the MEX, and it may be an opportunity just to look to book a little bit of profit here, particularly in this holiday shortened week.
Jeremy, what do you make of, a lot of the focus is on renminbi. Do you worry about defaults in China, or will the country just power ahead?
Well, I think the issue about the corporate sector or defaults or question marks about the banking sector is something which we periodically see markets fretting about. And I think this current cycle is no different to that in that regard. We will remain reasonably and cautiously constructive on the currency as a whole. And I think we will continue to see the currency gaining through the course of both the next few weeks, but also the next few months. So I think we can see it continuing towards the sort of the low 6 area. Yes, there are obvious uncertainties. Yes, there will be question marks as to how the new administration will play the China story, and whether there will be any changes in terms of the changing in terms of the macro relationships. But overall, yes, we have to remain mindful of those those issues regarding capital adequacy or financial sector uncertainty. But I think it isn't a story which, to our minds, is going to derail the China story. So we continue to be relatively bullish on the CNH and continue to see dollar CNH moving lower.
Jeremy, if we have a vaccine that works and distributed, that's widely available within the next 2 to 3 months, does it make it more likely that there's a central bank policy mistake? So too much monetary support, actually we have a vaccine, inflation shoots up and it's out of control?
Well, I think the story of reflation is definitely going to be one which is going to continue to be front and center through the course of 2021, not least of which because, of course, arithmetically, in view of the collapse that we've seen in terms of prices, there is going to be a rebound. Now, I think we're still in a scenario where many central banks are still looking to add stimulus. We can expect that from the ECB next month, in terms of the Fed, as I've already touched upon. So there is a risk, perhaps, that there could be a little bit of overstimulation. And of course, that comes back into the narrative of being supportive of risk assets. Are we necessarily going to see a significant spike in inflation? I'm not sure we're going to see an overt one, but I think we are going to see greater degrees of inflationary influences through the course of next year. And I think that will be something that investors need to be increasingly mindful of. I'm not sure yet, though, that we are in a scenario where we are going to see a central bank policy mistake, because, of course, as I say, the vaccine news is encouraging, but we're still possibly another 3 to 4 months away from seeing a generalized rollout of those vaccines, which will really facilitate a degree of normality in the global backdrop.
Jeremy Stretch, thank you so much for the brief this morning here. And we do this with a dollar weaker, 92.18 on DXY. I got to look on the chart, maybe here on the break, see if that's new dollar weakness. Coming up in the next hour, really looking forward, is Michael Spence, the laureate. I want to talk to him about information, how he won the Nobel Prize in the information that's out there as we move from Trump to Biden. Michael Spence at 6 o'clock. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg Surveillance. Good morning, everyone. An interesting week, to say the least. Usually this week is quiet. Somehow I don't think so this week. Francine Lacroix in London. I'm Tom Keene in New York. There's vaccine news, and we want to get to that. But right now, Dr. Fuseli steps in, of course, with all of his skill and knowledge in pharmacology. And Sam, I want to go to the mathematics. We got a chart here, folks, and it's not log, which I prefer, but it's a really nice chart of California and New York State, with New York, the big bubble in white first, and then California, a bubble months later on. And then they both turn up, and the rate of change is really not good. Sam, tell us about the second derivative now that you observe worldwide.
Yeah, hi. So it's interesting, Tom, because a little while ago we did highlight the fact that there is a disparity creeping into the data between number of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. Frankly, when it comes to analyzing all this data, you have to be very careful what you're looking at, because every region, I don't know what it's like in the States, whether every state has the same rule as to when to count a death as a COVID death. But I know for a fact that in the UK, Europe, various countries in Europe, etc., they count them differently. Now, cases, you've got somebody testing positive with PCR. Hospitalization, they go into hospital, they've got COVID-19. When they die, it actually becomes a bit tougher to assess these numbers. All awful, tragic stuff. But we still really have to keep an eye on how what we try and draw from these numbers.
You know, I look, Sam, at where we are in the vaccines, and I just got a tweet, and I really want you to comment on this. It's so important. We're treating the vaccine game in the media like it's Tottenham, Manchester City. It's like a sporting event. What do pros like you think about the idea, oh, they did 70%, and they did 82%, and they did 93%, and they should have hit that corner kick correctly? I mean, come on. It's not a sporting event, is it?
Absolutely not. But at the end of the day, when you've got a vaccine that gives you 70% efficacy versus one that's at 95% and potentially higher, you have to think about the maths going forward. You're going to need to inoculate, if that is the right answer when it comes to the final analysis, etc. You're going to have to inoculate many more people with the 70% efficacy vaccine than you need with the 94% efficacy vaccine to get to that crazy herd immunity.
Sam, will more people, I mean, is the biggest hurdle now, apart from regulation, actually getting people to take these vaccines?
Absolutely,
They're not going
absolutely.
To be so you have to convince people that they're safe.
That is the biggest problem. That is the biggest problem. And of course, with AstraZeneca, we've only got an interim analysis.
Yeah, but in people's eyes, Sam, which one's safer? You know, some of these vaccines we know about, the others are a brand new type of vaccine.
We'll need to wait and see the safety data for AstraZeneca's vaccine. We haven't seen it. So far, the Pfizer vaccine looks more tolerable than the Moderna vaccine, and we're going to have to wait for Astra to report.
how many doses can be available? Like if you look at the timeline, so how do you reach herd immunity? How many people need to take the shot, and how long does it need to last for? And are we certain that you don't pass it on once you have the vaccine?
You need to have at least 70%, 80% of people covered to get herd immunity with that sort of 95% effective vaccine. Of course, it depends on what the background infection rate has been, so therefore how many people already have immunity. And then beyond that, even if you have some transmission, you can get this out. You can get out from under it.
Sam Fazeli, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it this morning. Head of all of our pharmacology coverage on the vaccine as well. Futures up 23, maybe a high for the day. The VIX comes in 23.24. I need to really wait and see how the VIX shapes up in the early U.S. hours. Dollar weaker is a big deal. Looking over at Mexican peso, 19.99 right now on Mexican peso. So we are seeing advancing EM again this morning. Not out to records, but nevertheless, there it is. In our next hour, Joshua Sharfstein of the Bloomberg School of Public Health in Baltimore in the 6 o'clock hour. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
Expected, not only in terms of job creation, but also a sharp fall in the unemployment rate consistent with higher labor force participation. That's really good news.
Overall, the gain was solid, but even while this is a very robust pace of job gains, it's a lot slower than it has been in the summer months.
Great that we saw the job gains we did, but they still are diminished from what they were, of course, back in April and May. And the scarring, the sort of wounds that were created by COVID are beginning to fester.
I would caution people to look at the top line number because I don't think it tells the entire story. Employment relative to population is still well below where we were pre-crisis, and that's because I think that we're going to have some lasting damage.
Depending on what you look at, jobs creation or the unemployment rate, you have different views as to whether the improvement in the labor force is keeping up or slowing down.
This new law that came down from China's National People's Congress Committee ended up leading to the disqualification of 4 pro-democracy lawmakers.
This is probably the very final and complete crackdown.
I hope you understand it is not anything new at all. This was supposed to happen.
Explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe. This is Bloomberg Quick Surveillance, Tom and Francine from London and New York. Now let's get straight to the EV startup. Rivian is having a tough time meeting demand for its battery electric pickup truck, warning it sees supply constraints through 2023. Despite the backlog, though, the company already has its eyes on markets outside the US. Well, the chief executive spoke to Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow about the company's strategy for markets like Europe and Asia.
We have to get the gasoline and combustion-powered vehicles off the roads and replace them with much more efficient electric vehicles that have a pathway to being carbon neutral. Of course, with the grid also cleaning up. So to do that, it means we need to focus as a company, and I'd say as an industry, on more than just the U.S. And we see electrification happening very strongly throughout the rest of the world. Certainly, we see it in Europe, and certainly we see it throughout Asia. So for us, these are important markets, and these are markets that our product portfolio will go into, and as we launch future versions of or future variants in our portfolio, especially the smaller form factor variants, we see those fitting really nicely into Europe and fitting really nicely into China. So the whole business, the vehicle platforms, and the architectures were set up from the beginning to support sales in across the world, not just the United States, but in Europe, in Asia, and throughout the rest of the world.
Finally, President-elect Biden has some pretty clearly stated policies when it comes to clean energy and also electric vehicles. What do you think a Biden administration would mean for the vision that you just outlined? Do you see a Biden administration putting the United States and perhaps the world on a quicker timeline for electrification?
We talk about this a lot internally. You have, in terms of electrifying the world, you have two sort of sides of it. You have what's happening in the corporate world, meaning what are companies doing and how are they helping to drive that? And then, of course, the products that they create, causing customers to make that switch. And then you have the regulated side. And, what can policy, what can tax structures do to help accelerate that? And we're seeing increasingly across the world many major, major markets, countries that have lots and lots of sales, driving targets towards 100% electrification for new vehicle sales. We see that across Europe. We see that across China. So I think that's a very good thing for the world. I think it's a necessary thing to help make this shift faster. And of course, we're watching very closely to see what happens here in the United States. And we hope that the U.S. will be a leader in helping to create and drive policy that makes it easier for consumers to make that switch, and also makes it easier for manufacturers, all of us, to drive towards that future state.
Let me do a data check right now. Equities, bonds, currencies, commodities. Get this Monday started. Futures up 23, Dow futures 214, Dow level 29,426, the VIX 23.36. Where I'm interested, the currency market. Dollar weaker, that bears careful watching. Yen 103.71, euro on a cusp of 119, 118.81. Coming up, the former Prime Minister of Finland, Alexander Stubb. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
Well, the main instruments on board include a dual frequency radar altimeter. And This is the primary instrument of the mission, and that's the one that's measuring sea surface height, significant wave height, and wind speed over the ocean. And from those measurements, we can actually have the superb measurements that we expect of sea level rise, but also the waves. The significant wave height, which is the top 1/3 of the waves, if you were to look at them in time.
Sea level rise is accelerating, and it is not geographically uniform. In some regions, the rate of rise is 2 to 3 times faster than the global mean. This means that in this region, the elevation since the beginning of the 90s is now nearly 30 centimeters, which is not negligible.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
With the advances we are witnessing in the COVID-19 vaccine development, our top priority is to ensure affordable and equitable access to the vaccine and diagnostic tools for all.
Substantial financial gaps still need to be addressed, and we require innovative financing tools and pathways and an active involvement of the private sector.
Und dabei kann die G20 wichtiger.
If we stand together across the globe, we can control and overcome the virus and its impact. It is worth redoubling our efforts to achieve this.
Qu'avant la fin de l'année, un vaccin sera disponible.
We can reasonably expect that before the end of the year, a vaccine will be available. But another battle, a harder one, needs to be fought: universal access.
The UK has committed to equitable global access for any vaccine, and I would like to see the G20 nations collectively step up and support that effort.
Korea will work in partnership with the international community to put a complete end to the COVID-19 pandemic. We will marshal the forces to develop and distribute vaccines and treatments.
Some of the voices on the pandemic really roiling everyone now. The markets may be adjusting to it as well. We thank Sam Fazili for his attendance here moments ago, really running all of our pharmacology coverage. Right now, on his Europe, Alexander Stubb, he's a former Prime Minister of Finland, director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute, and someone widely traveled out of Daytona Beach in Florida, the Sorbonne, Furman University, and of course the London School of Economics. He's got a pedigree completely different than most. And what is so wonderful is his focus is on the issue of the moment in Europe. Prime Minister, I've been dying to speak to you of the fracture of Hungary and Poland. How isolated are they in taking on the Union?
Yes, thanks a lot, Tom. I do think that they are quite isolated, and the reason here is that there's a clear link between the so-called rule of procedure, what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do in the European Union, and the payments coming from the multi-annual framework and the recovery fund. So in that sense, now that it's an issue of values and money, I think both Poland and Hungary are pretty much cornered out and lonely.
What are the tools that the European Union has, that Brussels has in the major countries, frankly, including Finland? What are the tools they have to push against their populist tone?
I think one of them is actually communication, but the tools, if you are specifically referring to Poland and Hungary, are linked to finance. So the bottom line is, and put it in very simple terms, if you do not stick to liberal democracy, freedom of speech, rule of law, justice, equality, you're not going to get European funds. And I think that's quite a good incentive for countries like Poland and Hungary to fall in line.
But Alexander Stubb, this doesn't seem to be above. Great library, by the way. I know Tom, in his dreams, has the same library behind him. But
excuse me, Francine, it's a backdrop.
What do they want in return?
The library is a backdrop. He's at an ice hockey rink and there's a Zamboni behind him.
Of course it is. It's the new Zoom, the Zoom background. Alexander Stubb, I mean, are Hungary and Poland bluffing, or is this much more about, a clash of ideology?
I think it's probably a combination of the two. The nature of EU negotiations is such that you have so-called two-level games. In other words, on one hand, you have the negotiation going on among the heads of state and government, albeit online at the moment. And the other one is, how do you look at home? And any leader dealing with any kind of negotiating situation has to take both into account. So how do you get a maximum result on the European level, which you can then sell at home? So basically what Poland and Hungary will have to do in this particular situation is to show a certain courage to their own back home and their voters and say, look, we fought till the bitter end, but this is what we got. And then they try to communicate it in the right kind of way. That's the basic situation there. And by the way, the books are here from home, and there is this wonderful Twitter page which talks about bookcase credibility, if you will. I do warmly recommend it.
Rate my bookcase, I think, or room credibility. You're going to pass with flying colors, Alexander. When you look at, Alex, at some of the concerns for the European economy, we came out of the summer where everybody thought, look, Europe is going to do great. If you look at the pickup at the recovery fund, if you look at the focus on green, it'll go ahead and be much better than other parts of the world. Is this now reversing?
To a certain extent, yes. I think we're dealing with three issues here. One is the future of our financial system. Second one is health and pandemics. And I'm really glad to see the statements coming out of the G20 leaders, which you just put forward there a second ago. And third one is the future of globalization. Now, there is a clear link between seasonality, UV light, and viruses. This has been quite well, I think, documented by Nobel laureate Bengt Holmström, professor at the MIT. So the basic story is that in the northern hemisphere during the fall and winter months, when we lose a lot of the light, it gets colder. The viral distribution gets quite exponential. And then as we start moving towards the spring, we get more light, then the thing will be reversed. Now, adding to this that number one, we've learned more about the virus and how to deal with it. And number two, there is a vaccine in the pipeline. I think we will have weathered the storm, and I do hope that the worst will be over by next summer, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere.
I'm interested in your opinion, without getting into international warfare. Why did Sweden's strategy on the virus fail? There's a wide perception that it succeeded, and then Prime Minister, it just really didn't do all that well. Why did the Swedes fail at an original pandemic experiment?
I'm a firm believer in fact-based evidence, and to be honest, I am a humble political scientist, not a scientist per se. So I do not understand what the original analysis of the Swedish government and experts were, but I do know one thing, that I think this just proves that we really did not know or understand what the virus was going to mean and how it was going to react. And at the end of the day, of course, we are all trying to save lives, and I am absolutely sure that so did the Swedish government and all the experts involved.
Tell us your thoughts on herd immunity, please. This seems to be the tipping point, the strength of this virus, its virulence, if you will. Your thoughts on herd immunity and what it means for your Finland?
I do not have a sufficient enough scientific understanding about herd immunity. I can only say what I do myself. So on Saturday morning, I flew from Florence here to Finland. 72 hours before I flew, I took a test, negative. When I landed at 2 o'clock, I took a test and got a test result 6 hours later, negative. I'm still self-isolating, and in a total of 72 hours from when I landed, I will take another test tomorrow. If that is negative, I'll go out, whether there is herd immunity or not.
Alexander Stubb, talk to me a bit about the U.S. So last week you interviewed in one of the first public appearances of Hillary Clinton. We're still in a very difficult transition period, if you call it a transition, given the President Trump hasn't conceded yet. Will that hurt the standing of the U.S. within their political allies, its diplomatic allies?
I think most of the West, breathed a sigh of relief after the elections. Of course, all of us were following the election results as they were coming in. And right now, I think most European leaders are focused on the transition towards a Biden administration. Whatever President Donald Trump is doing at the moment through legal means is obviously viewed as something that the sitting president is doing. But I think in the long run, we are not worried about American democracy. American institutions have a tendency to take care of themselves. We saw that, of course, in Bush v. Gore in 2000. A result was there, and then it was approved. I, of course, as a transatlanticist, look upon the transition period with a certain sadness. I think it could be done in a much more dignified way, but I am convinced that come the 20th of January, Joe Biden will be the president of the United States, and vice president will be Kamala Harris.
Alexander Stubb, thank you so much for joining us. He's, of course, former Prime Minister of Finland, now a professor at EYU. And Tom, he's completely destroyed me in the library game. I mean, I'm trying to hold my own, but you can't, face off.
I noticed you moved the pickety. You moved the pickety. You moved the pickety. I notice,
I put Shakespeare for you, Tom. I did it for you.
My library backdrop at home.
In the next couple of days.
My library backdrop at home, folks, is 64 volumes of Nancy Drew. Francine, do you know what Nancy Drew is?
3 standard deviation.
Nancy Drew?
Of course I do. I grew up with Nancy Drew.
Good,
I have some of her stuff here as well.
Fine American literature.
To the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Hi, Francine. Another vaccine has shown promise in the fight against the coronavirus. The shot developed by the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca prevented a majority of people from getting the disease. It stopped an average of 70% of participants from falling ill. That's less than vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna. However, effectiveness rose to 90% for 1 or 2 dosing regimes. A former national security advisor to Joe Biden is expected to be named Secretary of State. The announcement about Anthony Blinken is likely tomorrow. Blinken also served as Deputy Secretary of State during the Obama administration. Plus, former Hillary Clinton aide Jack Sullivan is likely to be named Biden's national security advisor. And President Trump's campaign has disavowed a member of its post-election legal team. Sidney Powell has pushed some of the most extreme conspiracy theories around the vote. A statement from the campaign said that Powell is not a member of the Trump legal team, even though the president had said that she was. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the U.S. has withdrawn from the Open Skies Agreement because Russia isn't complying. The treaty allows countries to fly unarmed reconnaissance flights over each other's territory. It's designed to reduce the risk of war. Democratic Senator Bob Menendez calls the move reckless. He urged the incoming Biden administration to reverse the decision. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg, Tom.
Hi, Ritika. Thanks so much. Futures up 23 down. Futures up 215. Nice lift to the market. Big news. Weaker dollar this morning's front and center. Yen 103.74. I do note again, Mexican peso through 20 is a big deal. Coming up on Bloomberg Markets, Jan Hatzius, Goldman Sachs chief economist in the 10 o'clock hour. Always interesting to speak to Dr. Hatzius about this domestic economy and the dynamics of the American consumer. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
The president's legal team has been a national embarrassment. I voted for him twice, but elections have consequences. And we cannot continue to act as if something happened here that didn't happen. You have an obligation to present the evidence. The evidence has not been presented. And you must conclude, as Tucker Carlson even concluded the other night, that if you're unwilling to come forward and present the evidence, it must mean the evidence doesn't exist.
To our international audience, my producers have picked wisely. This was the interview of the weekend that really cut through the zeitgeist. The former governor of New Jersey saying to the gentleman of his same party, Mr. Trump, done, move on. It was a very elegant interview and really made some headlines through Sunday as well. Joining us now, someone who parses the headlines and truly parses the zeitgeist of the nation, Martin Schenker, our Bloomberg Chief Content Officer. Marty, good morning to you. What is the goal of the president today, besides trying to count votes in Milwaukee and out at the University of Wisconsin?
I think the goal is to keep the narrative going that, you know, this election was fraudulent and he's not going to concede. There's no sign he's going to do anything other than that. And, you know, despite all the losses in court.
Marty, those were not losses in court. I'll be honest, folks, over a beverage of my choice, I did not read all 37 pages of the federal judge in Pennsylvania, but scathing was the operative word, Marty. Who are the legal advisors to the president that can come and can bounce off of something like that decision?
Well, you know, his personal lawyer is Rudy Giuliani, and he shows no signs of changing tactics. I mean, they did revise some of their legal team over the weekend, but, you know, despite these outrageous and in some cases ludicrous allegations, he's going to continue to press his case, and there's some reports he's going to go directly to state legislatures to try and flip these results, which will not succeed.
Marty, some of, you know, President Trump's staunchest allies, I'm thinking of, you know, the senator from Alaska, the senator of North Dakota, yesterday called for the transition to Biden to begin. Who will ultimately convince the president, if anyone? I don't understand quite what the president is playing at. What's his end game?
His end game is to stay relevant. There are reports over the weekend that he's thinking about running for president again in 2024, which would be astounding because it would freeze the Republican field. But, you know, everybody's talking about rising pressure, but there's no pressure if he doesn't feel the pressure. And I get the sense that Donald Trump couldn't care less what Republicans are telling him to do.
How will he leave the White House?
Well, my speculation is that he will leave quietly, that he'll go to Florida or New Jersey and just not return to the White House. I've said that I think that Donald Trump will never really formally concede this race.
Marty, the great conversation at the Keene dining room table. Folks, there was TV dinners last night as we get ready for Thanksgiving. And Marty, the great discussion was getting to the Supreme Court. I mean, all of this is the emotion of the president focusing on Judge Judy and Fox TV and the rest of, I'm going to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to save me. You and I know what Bush v. Gore was and how the Supreme Court dealt with it. Is he going to get the same treatment?
I think until he presents a constitutional question of national importance, he's never going to get before the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court won't take that case because there's no case to take.
Marty, what is the symbolism of these three appointees? I mean, it's so important. Mr. Blinken, of course, with all sorts of public service to Democratic administrations. Mr. Sullivan, out of Minneapolis, helped Hillary Clinton and begged her to campaign more in the Middle West. And Linda Thomas Greenfield is extremely qualified, writing with William Burns in Foreign Affairs, arguably the most important essay of the last 60 days. What does it signal to see these three people is first out of the box for the president-elect?
I think it shows that Joe Biden thinks that our alliances are in desperate need of repair, and that he's going to pick an experienced and mature team to guide that process. And it's going to take some time. But he's going for it full bore.
Marty, how big are the legal troubles of Donald Trump once he's no longer president?
Well, the New York and Manhattan Attorney General have fraud investigations involving his use of deductions to lower his taxes. I think they're significant threats, but they'll probably take quite a bit of time, and Donald Trump doesn't seem to be particularly worried about it. But I think he will be spending a lot of time defending himself once he leaves office.
Marty, we're going to do this more often. Thank you so much. Martin Schenker, our Chief Content Officer, with just terrific news flow way too early in the morning for him. He's like a Washington guy. You know, he rolls out about 8:30 and gets ready for the first 10 a.m. meeting. We're going to, a guy up way too early for Washington. In our next hour, I really love talking to Don Beyer, a businessman from Virginia, somebody who's actually met a payroll. Don Beyer, Virginia, on the political moment at hand. In the markets, futures up 22, Dow futures up 214. Where do I begin on a weaker dollar? Let me begin. Well, Turkish lira backs up here, weaker lira this morning. Stay with us. An interesting market day. This is Bloomberg.
Once it goes into this plant, it's heated up very quickly to 600 or so degrees. It basically carbonizes it, turns it into a carbon-rich material. Obviously kills all of the pathogens.
give you a sense of the real-time action, the 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
With the Bloomberg Business Flash. The dollar has dropped to a 2.5-year low. Fast-track plans to in the US have boosted appetite for risk assets. The dollar has fallen more than 11% from its record high in March. Blackstone Group is doubling down on Asia. Bloomberg has learned the firm is seeking to raise at least $5 billion for its second private equity fund focused on the region. That's more than double the size of Blackstone's first Asia buyout fund. And the largest retailer of music instruments and equipment in the US has filed for bankruptcy. The filing will let Guitar Center stay in business while it figures out a restructuring plan for its debts. The bankruptcy plan calls for $165 million in new equity financing. Guitar Center expects to exit the court process by the end of the year. And rebalancing flows may lead to an exodus of around $300 billion from global stocks by the end of the year. That's according to JP Morgan. The bank says that large multi-asset investors may need to rotate money into bonds from stocks after strong equity performance this month. And that is your latest Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom Francine.
Rutika, thank you so much. Global stocks and equity futures, oil rising on optimism over COVID-19 vaccine. We just a couple of hours ago heard from AstraZeneca saying its shot prevented illness in most people, about 70%. U.S. moving closer also to mass immunization. And Tom, I know you wanted me to talk about pound. Look, if you look at sterling, remaining a victim of these Brexit-related headlines, but options now suggesting that a deal is largely priced in, Tom.
Very good. Please stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
We remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
this morning, stocks lift the dollar to pound sterling nears $1.34. Brent crude, $46 the barrel. Hospitalizations in America, they've doubled since Labor Day. Las Vegas, they cut casino capacity to 25%. The movie would have been Ocean's 3.25. And well, a normal weekend, Mr. Trump plays golf. He desires to recount votes in Biden-Philip Madison. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the president-elect intends to appoint long-term aides Antony Blinken and Jacob Sullivan in search of normalcy in foreign policy. Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg Surveillance, Tom Keene in New York, Francine Lacroix in London. Lots going on here, and I think really we should take here with all the different market and news about politics that we've got, Francine, to look at where we are in the medical space. And I find a lot of vaccine news and less, Francine, about the hospitalizations, which worldwide are stunning. In America, they won't bring one to silence.
Yes, Tom, you're right. But if you look at the hospitalization rate, again, it depends on country to country on how you measure it. I think the encouraging news that we heard from AstraZeneca this morning also gives a little bit more of a lift to the market. We remember the sick and we remember the people in hospital, Tom, but we also have treatments compared to March. So I think the situation is, not easier, but it's certainly more understandable than what we had back in March.
One of the widely looked numbers I look at, folks, a percent growth of deaths and cases have crossed the death rate, growing right now faster than the case rate. And some of that was widely expected. Always expected is a good brief. Our first word news. Here's Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, Tom. Another promising development in the fight to end the coronavirus pandemic. A vaccine developed by the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca prevented a majority of people in a large trial from getting the disease. It stopped an average of 70% from falling ill. That's below the high bar set by Pfizer and Moderna. But effectiveness did rise to 90% for one of two dosing regimes. Joe Biden plans to name longtime advisor Antony Blinken as Secretary of State. When Biden was vice president, Blinken served as his national security advisor and later Deputy Secretary of State. Bloomberg's learned that former Hillary Clinton aide Jake Sullivan is likely to be named national security advisor. And the Trump administration reportedly will ban tech exports to 89 Chinese aerospace and other companies. Reuters says the companies have ties to the Chinese military. It's a move that could escalate tensions as the Biden administration prepares to take over. And in the UK, Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak said he will increase spending on public services this week. He's trying to shore up the economy in the midst of a resurgence of the coronavirus. The focus of Sunak's spending review on Wednesday will be the pandemic. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg, Tom.
Interesting data check. Didn't expect it this week. Thank you, Ritika. Equities, bonds, currencies, commodities up 22 on SPX. VIX not giving me much of a price at 23.38. Interesting to see if we get to a 22 handle. I got to go to the dollar right now. Dollar weaker and moving weaker as we speak. DXY really getting down to August weakness, 92.08. Yen stronger, 103.69. Euro on the cusp of 19, 118.95. And sterling, I mean, Francine's buying drinks. That's all there is to it. Francine?
Yeah, except we're not moving anywhere, Tom. So if you live in one country, it doesn't make that much of a difference. I'm paid in pounds and spend in pounds. Tom, you were absolutely right at the top of the last hour to focus on currencies. If you look at the rotation to value, is of course an FX theme as well. Now, we had a bit of a taste of what may be coming. FX trades this month, a period marked by a passage of U.S. election, better than expected vaccine news, have definitely shown a strong negative correlation to their performance during March-October. That's according to some of our market analysis. If you look at, futures are up, equities here in Europe, they're up. And then I'm looking at pound because we understand that there could be already a Brexit deal priced in. And it seems there's a bit more optimism on what could be achieved. Sterling 133.66, Tom.
Very good. It was an interesting weekend. And to be blunt, out front was ABC in this week. George had a heck of a weekend with the governor of New Jersey, Mr. Christie. And here, Mr. Klain working for the president-elect.
on Tuesday of this week, meeting, in fact, the pace that was set by the Obama-Biden transition, beating the pace set by the Trump transition.
Ronald Klain there with This Week managing the message forward, and part of that message is Bloomberg breaking overnight 3 appointees, including for Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Looking forward to more details on that through Monday and Tuesday. Right now, and this is a joy, on too many topics, but how we think about those topics. Michael Spence joins us, the Nobel laureate with General Atlantic, is a senior advisor. Professor Spence, thank you so much for joining. And I want to go back to asymmetric information, which I guess we can talk. You know, Stiglitz had that ridiculously simple equation, which you tossed out the window. But when you look at asymmetric information, I want you to take it over to politics and explain the game theory of transition as you see it. What is so asymmetric about transition that we need to be aware and cognizant of moving to January 20th?
Well, I mean, you know, one administration's going out and the other one's going in. And what we're seeing now, I hope it changes, is that values triumph over game theory incentives in the transition, at least in all past cases, as far as I'm aware. At least in the last multiple number of elections, the transition has been a cooperative exercise. So basically, somebody flips a switch. Now, there's a huge amount of information transfer that's required. An incoming administration has to absorb a fantastic amount of information. So the asymmetry at the start is enormous, and that is why we count on having a cooperative approach to the transition.
I think of the work out of the University of Texas just simply on democracy. And Professor Spence, it goes to your statement on values as well. Do you perceive a normalcy that Mr. Biden can go to that is a foundational value, or does he need to construct new values?
No, I think by and large, at least from my point of view, Tom and Francine, he's going to values that we, are traditional relation in the foreign sphere, relationships with our allies, in the domestic sphere, trying to bring people together and to achieve, more inclusive growth patterns. I mean, I think he's sincere about that, and I don't think they're new values. It's a complicated environment, and he has to deal with a divided population, at least judging from the vote, on the one hand, and he has to deal with a pretty wide range of opinions about what the right policy approaches are within his own Democratic Party.
Professor, what does that mean for how Joe Biden deals with China? What does it mean with how he deals with vaccinations and coronavirus?
So coronavirus, let me take it in reverse order. Coronavirus, I think he and his team understand that it's very difficult to have a complete recovery without thorough containment of the virus. So I expect in the short run, and I haven't read much about this, that they'll go after that. And we may experience a bit of a dip economically as a result of that, because we've had a much looser approach up to